I know a lot of people are upset whenever there is a downturn and all the real sector businesses start to suffer, and the banks somehow seem not to suffer so much. But the first question I say to people is that if the banks are doing so well, why is everybody not buying? If we really think that the banks are doing so well, what do you do when an industry is outperforming everything else? You buy. Many of you here in the capital market, is it your experience that all your investors are queuing up trying to buy bank shares? If that is not the case, then there's something wrong with the idea that, oh, that's where the profit is, but I don't want it. So it's food for thought. Because what the point I'm making is, we may be looking at absolute amount. Somebody put down 300 billion in capital. And the day he declares 50 billion, you say he's doing so well. But somebody else who put 100 billion in capital and declare 40 billion, you say he's struggling. So there are issues around whether banks are performing or not. But let me go to the role that banks ought to play and why they haven't played it. First and foremost, I don't think it's actually entirely the fault of banks. Because if you would remember, up until about 14 years ago, a Nigerian could have 10 different identities, open 10 different banking accounts, and take a loan from 10 different banks, and there was no way you could tell. So without identity, when people kept saying, when are banks going to lend? I said, who are you lending to? We have multiple instances where those credits, people attempted and it failed. You'd also remember I think we've had the credit bureau system for less than 20 years. So prior to that, there is no central database where you can tell if somebody is a bad borrower. And of course, until we created the BVN, there was no way you could have a unique identity. So there are issues that can explain why financial services hasn't worked. Where I differ from those who explain it away is that the amount of resources that financial services control, from the human resources to the capital, but to the trust. This is one of the most trusted institutions till today. Despite everything that people say, tell them to take their money from a bank and give it to someone else and see how many people will do it. Your greatest trust is in where you will put your resources. It is still one of the greatest trust institutions. My concern is that competencies, that capital, that trust, we have not diverted it to go to where the real problem is. So when they talk about financialization, the idea that financial assets have become more important than the real asset, I actually think we're on the wrong side of that divide. Meaning that in some economies, the financial asset that you cannot trace to real economy has become so significant relative to the real economy. In Japan, for instance, the financial services sector is more than twice the GDP of the country, about 220%. Today, we still struggle around 20 to 25%. So we don't actually have enough financial asset to drive the growth that we need. But what needs to happen for that to happen is there is a deficit in our economy. Yes, there is the more obvious one, the ease of doing business, the infrastructure, the policy. We know that. The second deficit that you often not talk about is equity. In other words, the Nigerian economy does not have domestic savings. We do not have intergenerational wealth, so the average family starts off without any real access to equity as a form of wealth. And that is why the starting point for most people is to look for employment. Even if you have a brilliant idea, far too many people cannot become entrepreneurs because they don't have, first, that protection that comes from family wealth, so you feel that the bottom is not fatal. But secondly is that startup equity. Because if you remember, banking is leverage. And for you to take leverage, you have to have something. And if you haven't inherited wealth, and up until recently, we didn't have a venture capital ecosystem, even the concept of angel investing, these are all very new concepts. So most people go into bank looking for leverage, but they have not put anything on the ground. And so banking debt is usually not the best form of debt. And the reason we have a challenge with capital is because all of what constituted traditional capital was disrupted with colonialism. because every form of capital that you owned, whether it is commodities or real estate, passed on to the colonial. When they left, a lot of that passed back on to government. So over 70% of wealth in the world today is in real estate. And all of the real estate in Nigeria is vested in the state. Not only is it vested in the state has then not created the platform that allowed that real estate to have the feature of a financial instrument. In advanced economies, your real estate has tradability, traceability, it has liquidity, there's price discovery. So a hectare of land in your village, with all of that today, can exchange while we're in this room and give you access to some financial resources. Today, even if you have a hectare of land where I'm standing, it cannot translate into cash for you in less than 90 days because it takes that long for the transferability to be effective. And even at that, it is because people have found ways, because you cannot actually transfer assets of that class. And if you do transfer it, the actual cost is so prohibitive. So the challenge for us is to take all of that real estate, and convert it to financial assets. Because once we convert it to financial assets, suddenly the equity in the economy goes up immediately. The domestic savings goes up because every one of those assets can now attract financial equivalents. Then the second thing that then needs to happen is once we do have a second problem why attracting domestic equity is very hard. And it's sadly something that we struggle with, which is the birth rate. We are averaging about 5.3 birth per woman today. The total fertility rate in this country is one of the highest, bar maybe Niger and a couple of other poor countries. Why does that matter? Because any family that has that number of kids has no savings. Any family that has that number of kids has zero savings because from healthcare, education, and feeding, all that you earn will be spent. And for a society to begin to grow, you've got to get to a point where that fertility rate comes down. And the only way the fertility rate comes down is through education, particularly education of the girl child. So as a financial institution, therefore, if you are not thinking about the fundamental issues with society and you are waiting and competing and looking for deposit, then you've stopped playing a developmental role.
What are the policy imperatives to transcend from financialism of the Nigerian economy into a production and innovation economy for impactful development?
The most important thing about building a production economy is to build a workforce. Without the right human resources, any industry, any sector you choose to focus on will struggle. So it's very important for us to move from certification to skills, to actually real capacity to do the job. The second one, and equally important, is energy. Most real sector growth can benefit from more affordable, more consistent, and more reliable energy sources. It is very, very important. And the last one is we need to reduce the friction, the amount of frictions that businesses encounter when they're trying to build and grow is too much for an economy that is just developing. We need to therefore reduce the amount of regulation, optimize the regulation. For instance, by consolidating the taxes that government collects, collecting fewer taxes and reducing the cost of tax collection, it also makes it easier for the business. So there are ways for us to reduce friction. So talent is important, energy is critical, and obviously we must have ease of doing business, meaning fewer regulations.